Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is an overused phrase, but I'm going to use it myself, and that is to say that I'm introducing someone who needs no introduction, at least to anyone who reads the newspaper or watches the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. But our speaker today, Andrew Coyne, is one of the best-known media voices, public analysts we have in Canada today. He, I guess, earns his living by being a columnist with Postmedia News. He was raised in Winnipeg, as Jim adverted to by noting his father. Andrew is a graduate of the University of Toronto and of the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's written, as we all know, for Maclean's, for the National Post, the Globe. He's contributed to virtually any news magazine you can find on the stands, and he's a frequent commentator on television and radio. And as we all know, he's a regular member of the At Issue panel on CBC's National News. So, with no further ado, can I ask you to join me in welcoming Andrew Coyne?
Well, thank you, Dean, and thank you, Jim, and thank you, members of the Leitch family, for involving me in this great event. I want to say that I am fully conscious of the honor that you do me by asking me to give this address, and of the responsibility that goes with it to do honor to the memory of Merv Leitch. He was, by all accounts, an extraordinary person, not only as a lawyer and political leader, but as a man, with those qualities of humility, selflessness, duty, and concern for others, so typical of his generation. I will do my best to fulfill that responsibility. And I wanted to just have a quick disclaimer. I'm going to say a few tough things about politics in the course of these remarks, but there are always honorable exceptions, and we should never forget that. And by all accounts, Merv Leitch was certainly the best that we could ask for in a political leader. One of the trials of writing for a newspaper, and there are very few, is that you do not typically get to write your own headlines. The column might be an incisive, even groundbreaking dissertation on the problems of the Canadian healthcare system, but if an editor slaps "Predators from Mars ate my baby" on top of it, you got to go with it. In the present case, things worked out rather differently. Not only was I allowed to choose the title of this lecture, the organizers insisted on it. "Can you just give us a heading for the speech?" they inquired about 6 months ago. "Oh, God, I don't know," I said without giving it much thought. "What about the alarming state of Canadian democracy?" I was mostly just trying to make them go away. But as I thought about it afterward, the title seemed to me more and more apropos, and particularly that word, alarming. I might, after all, have said the depressing state of Canadian democracy, or the degenerate state of Canadian democracy, or even the faintly ludicrous state of Canadian democracy. But no, I think alarming gets the point that I wanted to make quite nicely. Because I think we have tripped some sort of wire in recent years. It is alarming. And if we're not yet alarmed, we bloody well ought to be. Put plainly, in my submission, we no longer live under the system we think we do. We have the form of a parliamentary democracy, but not the substance. No, we have not become a tyranny. We do not fear the midnight knock on our door in this country. But if government is not our master, neither is it wholly our servant. We've not become a dictatorship, but we are no longer quite a democracy, not in any meaningful sense. No democracy is perfect. People in every country complain about the faults in theirs. But somewhere along the way, I believe ours crossed the line. Democracy, real democracy, is slipping away from us. Not irrevocably, I hope, but it's only a hope. Some of the problems with our system are long-standing and well-known. Some are of more recent vintage. And while any of them on its own might not trouble us unduly, their accumulated weight should, not least because each new abuse, each further assault, only weakens our defenses for the next. The failings are profound and across the board, from the conduct of our elections, to how we count the votes, to the way that Parliament works or doesn't work. We should beware, of course, of falsely idolizing how politics used to be in this country, but we should equally steer clear of the lazy assumption that it's always been this way. It hasn't. It's worse now. This is not, I should stress, intended primarily as a commentary on recent political controversies or an indictment of any one party. The dismantling of Canadian democracy is a glittering bipartisan achievement. And while I will spend most of my time talking about the federal domain, much of what follows applies equally to provincial politics. I'll venture to guess that some of it might even apply in Alberta. So allow me, if you will, to raise the alarm at the state of our democracy. Let's start with a pretty clear warning signal: voter turnout. Turnout in federal elections has been on the decline for more than 20 years. In the 16 elections from 1945 to 1993, turnout averaged nearly 75%. In the 6 elections since then, it has averaged just 62%. And that's of registered voters, that is, of the names Elections Canada maintains on its permanent electors list. Throw in those who registered on election day or those who never registered at all, and the reality is that barely half the voting age population casts their ballot nowadays. We can't be sure of the reasons for this, of course, and other countries have also experienced declines in turnout. But if I had to speculate on some of the causes, well, let me just see. When the prospective voter looks at the candidates in his or her riding, what does he see? He sees creatures of the parties, their nominations having been secured either by busloads of instant members or else by being parachuted in at the behest of the party leader, but in either case dependent utterly on the approval of the leader, who is required by law to sign his nomination papers before he can run. Perhaps the voter is interested in where the candidate stands on the issues, but it doesn't really matter what the candidates stand for because all policy is set by the parties, and it doesn't matter what the parties stand for because at any given time they generally stand for the same thing, and because whatever they stand for today, they will stand for its opposite tomorrow. When the voter watches the election campaign, what does he see? He sees campaigns dominated by attack ads, photo ops, attack ads, and news coverage heavily focused on polls, gaffes, and inside baseball discussions of strategy, mostly about attack ads. Then the votes are counted, and what does the voter see? He sees a parliament that looks nothing like what the voters cast their ballots for, with a distribution of seats between the parties bearing no resemblance to the division of opinion in the country. He sees that the MP he elects has no real role or responsibility, but to stand up and sit down when he's told. He sees a parliament that collectively has very little ability to hold governments to account. He sees that all power resides in the office of the Prime Minister. In recent years, he's seen parties and leaders not only go back on their word or abandon their convictions, but break their own laws. He's seen MPs being offered government jobs to cross the floor, and governments refusing to acknowledge confidence votes or proroguing Parliament rather than face one, or defying express orders of Parliament to surrender documents. And every day, he sees a politics dominated by coarseness, cynicism, name-calling, and mindless partisanship. A viciousness made all the more stupefying for the absence of real divisions among the parties. If politics generally can be defined as people behaving badly for good reasons, our politics involves people behaving appallingly for no reason at all. And you ask, why doesn't he vote? Frankly, the only mystery in all this is why so many people still do. Elections about nothing, parties reduced to leadership cults, the impotence of ordinary MPs, the irrelevance of Parliament, and their absolute powers of the Prime Minister. If we were writing about a third world country with a system like ours, we would be careful, we journalists, to refer to its largely ceremonial Parliament and sham elections. Only force of habit prevents us from applying the same terms here. Do I exaggerate? Well, let's go into some of these issues in more detail, starting with election campaigns. And let's start with the issue that more than any other comes up in surveys as the reason people don't vote: trust. Or to give it its proper name, lies. Politics has never been noted as a place for unsparing honesty. At best, it consists of telling people what they want to hear. It deals in shades of truth, selective facts, exaggeration, blarney, and spin. But in most places, at most times, it has been expected that politicians will stay within some sort of limits. If you wish to deceive, do so by the sly omission, the evasive answer, the non-denial denial. Equivocate if you can, mislead if you must, but don't say straight up, without room for ambiguity, in a manner that's intended to be believed, something that you know is false. But somewhere along the way, that taboo was broken in Canada, and nowhere more so than in that most fundamental unit of democratic currency, the campaign promise. Perhaps it began with Pierre Trudeau, who campaigned furiously against wage and price controls in the 1974 election, only to introduce them shortly afterward. There followed Brian Mulroney, who unctuously upbraided John Turner for his patronage sins as if he were not himself about to take the practice to new depths, or new heights if you prefer. Jean Chrétien, who promised to abolish the GST and renegotiate NAFTA but did neither. Stephen Harper, who having promised he would appoint no one who was not elected to either cabinet or Senate, on his first day as Prime Minister appointed his unelected Quebec organizer Michael Fortier to both, a pattern that was to be repeated in everything from fixed election dates to the taxation of income trusts to. This is hardly reserved to federal politics. Of Dalton McGuinty's broken promises would fill a scrapbook. The former Liberal Premier of New Brunswick, Sean Graham, elected on a promise not to sell New Brunswick Power, proposed to do just that once safely elected. The former Premier of Nova Scotia, New Democrat Darrell Dexter, came to power promising he would neither raise taxes, cut spending, nor run a deficit. He proceeded to do all three. I need hardly dwell on British Columbia's Gordon Campbell and his disavowal prior to the 2009 election of any intent to harmonize the province's sales tax with the federal GST. You can write the epitaph that follows. These were not, it must be stressed, casual slips of the lip, minor items at the bottom of each party's wish list. These were central planks in their platforms, often the major point of divergence between them and their opponents, in some cases arguably the key to their victory. It's not an answer to say, well, you can throw the bums out at the next election, when the question of who said what 4 years ago would have to contend with 40 other more pressing immediate issues. The public should not have to choose between honest government and health care. It should be a given. In any case, the problem is not so much that liars are prospering as that honest politicians have no way of establishing their bona fides anymore. Why should anybody believe any of them is the attitude of most voters, fairly or unfairly. This is not politics as usual. It's something far worse. It's not just corrosive of public trust, it makes it impossible for the public to base their vote on anything. How can the public assess even the general direction the candidates would take if they can have no confidence in any particular piece of evidence offered to that effect? A second related issue, almost as certain to depress turnout, indeed calculated to do so, is attack ads. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with politicians criticizing one another, going negative in the vernacular. But it matters how you go about it, whether your aim is to engage the public or inflame them. Those in the game offer two standard defenses for attack ads. One, well, the other guy started it. You have to understand, people in politics have the moral universe of a 9-year-old. And this is invariably true. Whatever sin one party may have committed, it can always find a precedent in its opponents, which is handy since it means neither side need justify its actions in its own right, but only by way of the others. Oh, and the second justification? They work. This is presented not as an amusing irony or a comment on man's fallen nature, but as a moral justification. They work. Oh, they work. Oh, I drop all my objections. So often has this been repeated that it's become accepted wisdom. They work. Say what you will about attack ads, my fellow pundits will observe ruefully, but they work. Really? Then why do they have to keep making new ones? Elections generally have losers as well as winners, and both sides are running all kinds of attack ads all the way through the campaign. Somebody's ads must not be working. In fact, most of them don't. Political parties come up with dozens of ads in the course of a campaign. Some work, most fail. Sometimes they even backfire, seen by the public as so over the top that they redound against their sponsors rather than their intended target. There's a case to be made against attack ads, but it isn't that they inevitably tilt the field in favor of one party or another. It's rather that they pollute debate and coarsen the culture. As I say, politics inevitably involves some mutual criticism, But tone matters, as does truth. Truth not merely in the sense of literal factual correctness, but fairness, proportion, and context. What is objectionable about attack ads is not that they're negative, but that they're corrosive. Their intent is not merely to criticize, to point out failings, it's to inflame. They're not trying to provoke thought, but to shut it down. The result is not merely to damage one party or the other. The whole profession is degraded to the point that people tune out of politics altogether. The comparison has been made many times. If the airlines ran attack ads savaging each other's safety records, nobody would fly on any of them. Indeed, politics looks very much like an industry in decline. I talked about the turnout figures, but not only has the market for politics overall been dwindling, but so, more strikingly, is the share of the market controlled by its leading players. A generation ago, the winning party in an election, conservative or liberal, could consistently persuade 30 or 40 or sometimes even 50% of the voting age population to come out to vote for it. In recent elections, that has fallen to 22%. That's your democratic mandate for a majority government nowadays. If any normal industry were experiencing this sort of catastrophic decline, they'd be turning themselves inside out, trying to figure out what was going wrong. Only in politics would such a galloping disaster be treated as business as usual. Of course, these days, the attacks, as often as not, are delivered not through the mainstream media, where they can be viewed, assessed, and criticized. They're delivered, rather, through targeted micromedia, notably the infamous robocalls. I've no wish to rehearse here the scandals over those overtly misleading and illegal robocalls, which everyone rightly denounces. I'm talking about the perfectly legal, perfectly respectable robocalls on which every campaign has come to rely. As Michael Kinsley famously put it, the scandal's not what's illegal, the scandal's what's legal. We've come to believe that such mass phone operations involving literally millions of calls, legal, ethical as may be, is perfectly normal, something we should just take for granted. But in fact, it's all highly abnormal. The phoning, the targeting, the voter identification, all of it. You're perhaps familiar with the phenomenon by which the electorate is sliced and diced into ever more narrowly defined demographic groups, composites of age, sex, race, class, marital status, location, and so on, with cutesy names like Zoe or Dougie assigned to represent them. And if you want a very good exploration of this, I urge you to read Susan Delacourte's important new book, Shopping for Votes. What you may not be aware of is how information on individual voters, that would be you, is increasingly being compiled and collated into personal profiles far beyond your name and phone number. Robocalls aren't simply another medium of broadcasting. They're precisely targeted narrowcasts, and the target is you. The party calling knows who you are, which party you support, and what sorts of issues people like you are concerned about, and in the intimacy of that phone call can tell you exactly what you want to hear without concern for how the same message might resonate with other voters. What the mass media of the 20th century largely took away from the parties, the ability to say one thing to one group of voters and another, sometimes contradictory thing to another, the micromedia of the 21st century has restored. As I say, we've all grown used to this, conditioned to think of it as part of the political game. Reporters write admiring profiles of the strategists behind the campaigns who modestly boast of their prowess at, quote, moving the numbers. The voting public are invariably described in such logistical terms as if we were so many packages to be delivered. I get why the parties think this way. What I don't get is why the rest of us should. Why we should consent to being treated in this condescending, manipulative way. Not because of the potential for abuse, because it is abuse. Of course, it's not all darkness and rain on the modern campaign. There's always those signature events of hoopla and excitement, the televised leaders' debates. There's something just a little bit disturbing about deciding an election, not even on the basis of what was learned in the brief chaos of a 5-week campaign, but purely on the strength of who won or lost on a single night as determined by those peerless arbiters, the media. We're electing a government, not a high school debating champ. Don't get me wrong, debates can be valuable opportunities to compare and contrast the leaders and their platforms. Each of the leaders gets the chance to probe the other's weaknesses, while the public is granted an extended period of close-up scrutiny of the candidates in a spontaneous setting. But that's a very different thing than what the debates have become, which is basically a prize fight. The candidates are encouraged to shout over each other, to go toe-to-toe, to mix it up, in hopes of that holy grail of media moments, the knockout blow. And after every debate, some reporter somewhere, without evident sense of irony, writes another story saying mournfully that there were no knockout blows. Or as Rick Salutin once put it, no usable clips. This feeds the media's appetite for conflict and its addiction to narrative. It has no other use. 5 leaders, 4 subjects, 3 pundits, and a moderator shouting over each other for minutes on end. Why have the debates so full of promise become such wastes of time? Because we've left the design of them to the last minute ad hoc negotiations between the networks and the parties, vested interests all. The party ahead in the polls wants to have none. The party behind in the polls wants to have 6. They saw it off at 1, or rather 1 in each language. This curious linguistic segregation, observed nowhere else in our national practice, in our national politics, in practice means 1 debate for the rest of the country and one whose sole focus is Quebec. So the rest of us get to watch 2 hours of somebody demanding, why haven't you paid for repairs to the Champlain Bridge? We're quite used to simultaneous translation in this country. Why on earth do we put up with this? I alluded to the media's role, and I'd be remiss if I did not dwell on that malevolently for a bit. Because we journalists, we make an invaluable contribution to ruining virtually every election that comes our way. Politicians learn from their mistakes. Sometimes we just go on repeating ours. We can't help ourselves. After every election, we retire defeated to our newsroom postmortems, and each time we vow, never again. Never again will we sit up and beg for our Gainsburgers, the little meaningless morsels of news the parties dole out each day to keep us complicit in their charades. Never again will we chase every fleeting poll, salivate over every minor gaffe. Never again the gotcha question, the silly photo op, the constant search for defining moments and turning points, the investing of trivial campaign mishaps with metaphoric import. You've seen those. The bus gets lost. In a metaphor for what is a failing campaign. And then after these vows, we go out and we do it all over again. I don't know whether it's learned behavior or whether it's instinctive, responding to some deeply recessed part of the journalistic brain. I only know that we're hurting democracy. We aren't just missing an opportunity to help the public make sense of things at a critical time. We're making things worse. We're actually getting in the way. The question most readers or viewers, most voters, I submit, would like answered in the course of any campaign, well, there's 2 questions, is who are these people and what are they going to do to us? Oh, all right, for us. And what instead do we tell them? Well, we tell them who's ahead and who's behind. And then we tell them who's ahead and who's behind. After a while, we tell them who's still ahead and who's still behind. And eventually, we descend on whoever's behind, and we ask them, why are you behind? Over and over and over. Why are you behind? What makes you such a loser? Why won't you admit that you're a loser? If you were a tree, what kind of loser tree would you be? Apparently, we hope that if we keep at it long enough, we might be able to make them cry. When that gets boring, we speculate on whether the ones who are ahead can stay ahead or whether they've peaked too soon, and whatever space we have left over, we devote to the strategists. Read the coverage in any major daily on any given day. Watch the television. It's not about the election. It's about the campaign. Among other ills, this requires us to give over acres of space and time to the deep thoughts of one or another of the many thousands of smirking strategists with which this country is apparently endowed. But we do it because in his secret heart of hearts, that's who the journalist wishes he was. One of the players, the guys in the room. We write about the horse race, the polls, and the strategy, not because it matters to more than a handful of our readers, but because it matters to the pros, the people we cover, the people we talk to, the people we idolize. We parrot their language even as we absorb their values. The latest campaign ad is analyzed from any number of angles. Will it work? Is it on message? What will it mean for the brand? Except the most obvious. Is it true? But even if we had the most perfect election campaigns imaginable, we would still have to reckon with the carnage wreaked by our antiquated, unrepresentative, divisive electoral system. First past the post, where the plurality, not the majority, wins. I could spend a whole speech or two, I promise you, on its defects, but just a very quick recap here. Every election in my lifetime has produced a distorted funhouse mirror version of what the electorate actually voted for. Let's take, just at random, the 2000 election. The NDP, with 2.6 million votes, got 29 seats. The Bloc Québécois, with 1.6 million, got 51 seats. The Greens, with more than 650,000 votes, got 0 seats. Liberals in the West, Tories in Vancouver and Toronto, Federalists in Quebec, all greatly underrepresented, distorting our perception of the country and needlessly aggravating regional tensions. Combine that with the vast disparities in the number of voters per riding, and it takes as many votes to elect one Tory MP in some Alberta ridings as it takes to elect 5 Liberal MPs in PEI and Labrador. A system in which one person's vote is worth 3 times, or 4 times, or 5 times, or sometimes 52 times another person's vote, depending on which party they'd vote for or which riding they're in, is only approximately democratic. Indeed, for most voters, their votes are effectively worth nothing at all. If you vote for anyone but the winning candidate in our system, and that would be more than 50% of the voters in most elections, you are effectively denied representation. The winner in that multi-candidate riding might romp home with 30% of the vote, on the basis of which they will claim 100% of the representation. The same trend is then aggregated over all of the ridings to produce majority governments with the support of less than 40% of the vote, who then go on to claim 100% of the power. Worse, voters are constantly told they cannot vote for the candidate they prefer lest they split the vote, but must vote for some other candidate they detest in order to prevent the candidate they detest even more from getting in. That's unless they live in a safe seat, which would describe a great many of them, in which case there's very little point in voting at all. The fundamental promise of democracy is one person, one vote. Everyone gets one vote, and every vote is equal. That's simply not the case in Canada today, and may explain why so many Canadians refuse to indulge in this pretense. But the worst effect of first past the post isn't felt on election day, but every day in between. It's the incentives it creates for certain types of political behavior that is its most damning indictment. The important thing to know about first past the post is that it's highly leveraged. Not only did the party's representation in the legislature bear no resemblance to their respective shares in the popular vote, but tiny swings in the vote can lead to exponentially larger swings in electoral outcomes. A 2% shift in the popular vote means 60 seats in the House or more. Finding and mobilizing those voters then, those swing voters, that tiny sliver of the electorate, is thus a matter of huge consequence to the parties. But of course, these are the voters paying least attention. They are the least engaged, least informed voters in the country. They are, to adopt Susan Delacourte's terminology, they're the voters who make up their minds at the checkout counter. That's who's deciding our elections. So we get, as a result of this, long periods of monotony when the parties take no particular positions. We're in that right now federally, for fear of alienating the swing voters, punctuated by wild frenzies of wedge issues, which we call elections. Moreover, when a party needs only a small slice of the electorate to win, they have very little incentive to make themselves less obnoxious to the rest. Indeed, they have every incentive to amp up the us and them, black hats and white hats rhetoric, the better to lock down their support. So some of the viciousness of our politics can also be attributed to this perverse system. Is it any wonder that so few democratic countries still employ it? But let's move on to more pressing matters, because unavoidably after the election comes Parliament, at which point most of us are moved to ask, what on earth was the point of all that? For that matter, so do many MPs. That's how irrelevant Parliament has become. What, in fact, do we elect MPs to do? Let's think of some of the reasons why we might elect members of Parliament. To examine and scrutinize legislation, to look for weaknesses and try to improve it. Well, not when dozens of laws of vastly differing purpose can be bundled together into omnibus bills, hundreds of pages of long, basically the whole of the government's spring or fall agenda in one bill, leaving scant hours or even minutes to study any individual piece. Even worse, the business of supply, the whole budgeting process, the fundamental prerogative of parliaments going back to Simon de Montfort, has, by many experts' accounts, broken down almost entirely, with MPs handed the estimates weeks before the budget on which they're supposedly based, each document on a different accounting system, the figures broken out in a way that nobody can understand, including trained accountants. All right, maybe we want them to debate legislation. Debates. The arguments are rote, attendance is sparse, no one's mind has been changed by a parliamentary debate in 60 years. That's when debate is permitted, and not, as has happened 50 times in this session alone, curtailed by a government motion of time allocation. Time allocation, of course, the politer cousin of closure. There was a time in this country when if you invoked closure, it was kind of a big deal. Those of you who know your history will study the pipeline debate of 1956, one of the great parliamentary brawls in Canadian history, went on for weeks on end. Why? Because the government had invoked closure in peacetime. It was like an emergency decree. It was treated as if it was practically martial law. Because in those days, people took Parliament seriously. You didn't cut off debate in Parliament. Who would think of such a thing? Now it happens every other day, and nobody even notices. I could say the same about the omnibus bills, by the way. It was even as long ago as 1982, as quickly, as recently as 1982, that we had the famous bell-ringing episode because the government had put too many bills together into one omnibus bill. And to be fair, when they did it again at a grander scale than anybody had accomplished before last year, there was quite a fracas. And then they did it again in the fall, and there was a little bit less of a fracas. And, you know, each time they do it, it's less and less of a big deal. Oh, but they get to vote, MPs. They get to vote on legislation. Yeah, not so much. Canada has, experts agree, among the strictest systems of party discipline in the democratic, or I dare say non-democratic world, affording individual MPs the least leeway to vote as their conscience or their constituents dictate, not for nothing are MPs sometimes referred to as $160,000 voting machines. Propose legislation, they can do that. They can propose legislation, yeah. In a typical year, maybe 3, maybe 4 private members' bills will actually pass into law. Not only must they get through the lottery, but votes on PMBs are increasingly whipped contrary to parliamentary tradition, so even that's gone by the board. Indeed, as we were reminded last spring, MPs cannot even ask questions in the House or make routine members' statements, let me repeat that, members' statements, without the permission of the party whips. And when they do, they are as often as not confined to reading out lines written for them by party communications staff. So that's what we elect members of Parliament to do as they're told, to speak as they're told, to vote as they're told, to stand in their place when they're called upon, and to sit down after, to attack their opponents on cue and shout their support for the leader, often to the tune of a standing ovation. I blame Joe Clark for this last part. When the Clark Tories came in, they thought that our fine old Canadian tradition of desk thumping was too unseemly, and so they said we're going to replace it with applause. And the thing about applause is it's subject to applause inflation, that the mere applause isn't enough, and so you have to applaud much louder, and then you have to stand and applaud, and then you have to stand and shout, and that's what Parliament looks like nowadays, is every time the leader burps, his entire caucus jumps to their feet, shouting their applause, and you thought my third world illusion was an exaggeration? It's kind of like what it looks like. Parliament is simply not the place where important matters are debated, decided, or even announced anymore. It's become a largely ceremonial body, a glorified electoral college. Its role is to take that 40% of people who voted for the party in power and to, through the magic of first past the post arithmetic, turn that into a majority. And once they've done that, they basically have ceased to have much use. how did it come to this? The answer lies not so much in the formal rules of the game as in the relative powers of the players. MPs are weak in the main because their leaders are too strong. If we don't redress that imbalance, nothing else will change. Simply allowing more free votes, for example, which is the kind of reform that every person, every potential leadership candidate who doesn't really intend to change anything, that's the first thing they promise. I can tell you it will do little on its own because free votes, as things stand, are never truly free. The date when party leaders began to get the upper hand over the caucus can be marked with some precision. It traces back to the 1919 Liberal National Convention that chose Mackenzie King as its leader. Previously, party leaders in Canada had been chosen as they are in the classic Westminster model, still in force in Australia, for example, by a vote of the caucus. As they were made, so they could be unmade. In such a system, even prime ministers can be removed by caucus at any time, as Margaret Thatcher was, as Australia's Kevin Rudd was, and as his successor, Julia Gillard, was in her turn. It's not hard to see how this would make a party leader a little bit more attentive to the concerns of ordinary MPs. By contrast, a leader in possession of the mandate of heaven from the membership is free to thumb his nose at the caucus for long periods at a stretch. In extraordinary cases, after much acrimony and paralysis, a leader can still be forced out by his MPs de facto, but the knowledge that this would precipitate not a quick sounding of caucus but a months-long leadership race makes this the atom bomb of political maneuvers, so awful as to be of little use, whereas Thatcher was replaced in a matter of days. But that's only one side of the equation. If the leader dominates caucus, it's not only because they do not choose him, it's because he almost literally chooses them. In Canada, as I mentioned, as a matter of law, no candidate may run for Parliament under a party banner without the signature of his leader on his nomination papers. This gives the leader an absolute veto over the nomination of every member of caucus, real or prospective, which means get out of line and you'll never run again. Yet this is pathetically defended oftentimes by MPs themselves. How? How, they ask. How could a leader be expected to put up with a candidate who was damaging the party's brand, like they'd been stealing from the till or something? This is how fully they've absorbed the notion that MPs are in effect the leader's employees. It's always possible, I grant, that a riding association could nominate a candidate so abhorrent to the party that it would have no choice but to withdraw its imprimatur. They nominated a Nazi or something. But why should that be the prerogative of the leader? Why can't that be a vote of the other riding associations? Why do we automatically assign the power, all the power, to the top person? Even if MPs, however, did not need the leader's signature on their nomination papers, they would still have ample reason to follow his dictates. Ambition is the real party whip, commanding obedience where mere threats might not. This is especially true on the government side, given the range of offices and favors that are in the Prime Minister's power to bestow. Let's just talk about the Prime Minister for just a second. In other countries, executive power is subject to various checks and balances, whether in the formalized separation of powers that an American president must negotiate or the multi-party coalitions that are the norm in most European countries. Nothing of the same limits a Canadian Prime Minister, certainly one in possession of a majority. Prime Ministers in any Westminster system have always been powerful, but ours have amassed powers that are quite without parallel. As the distinguished political scientist Peter Russell has said, it's like a presidential system without the Congress. So let's talk particularly about the powers of appointment of a Canadian Prime Minister. Well, he appoints the Governor General. He appoints the senators. He appoints every member of the Supreme Court and all the federal court judges too. He appoints the clerk of the Privy Council, every deputy minister, the governor of the Bank of Canada, the heads of all the major crown corporations, even the ambassadors. He appoints the chief of the RCMP. He appoints judicial inquiries, and as we've seen, he can dismiss judicial inquiries. Those independent officers of Parliament, like the Auditor General, the Information, Privacy, and Ethics Commissioners, all appointed by the Prime Minister as well, along with parliamentary secretaries, committee chairs, and he makes all of these appointments without any independent oversight of any kind. True, it's customary to consult on some of them. There are tentative steps in the direction of parliamentary review of Supreme Court appointments. We saw how effective the last one was. Or indeed, someday, maybe, possibly, popular election of senators, but as of today, the power to appoint most of these people remains exclusively the purview of the Governor General and Council, which is to say, the Prime Minister. The choice is his, and his alone. Most important, he appoints the Cabinet. At 39 ministers, we have the largest cabinet in the democratic world, much larger than in any comparable country. The President of the United States is somehow able to get by with a cabinet of just 15, plus 7 cabinet-level officers, so call it 22, to govern the United States of America. The Prime Minister of Japan, the Chancellor of Germany, in the high teens. Britain, Australia, and New Zealand all have cabinets with fewer than 24 ministers. Why does Canada need nearly twice as many? It wasn't always thus. Sir John A. Macdonald governed with only 12, and as late as Louis Saint Laurent, there were still fewer than 20. Well, we know why we have a cabinet of 40, because we're not appointing cabinet ministers. We're appointing placeholders. We're appointing people to, give you regional and ethnic and gender diversity and to make peace with certain sections of the party, et cetera. And when you start doing the math on that, it becomes very hard to do that with less than about 50 or 60. It's a miracle we keep it down to 40. But what does it mean for the individual MP? Well, given a typical majority governing caucus of between 160 and 180 MPs, and bearing in mind the probability of some ministers stepping down or being replaced in the life of a government, it means an MP on the government side, if he keeps his nose clean, has at least a 1 in 4 chance of making it to cabinet. So you keep your nose clean. Compare that to Britain, where the odds are more like 1 in 20. And if you follow British politics, one of the glories of it is that there are hundreds and hundreds of government-side MPs who are never going to make it to cabinet. And they know it. So they get up to useful mischief. They become the dean of the House on some particular subject. They head a committee. They make trouble in Parliament over an issue of concern to their constituents. They vote sometimes against their party if they think they're on the wrong track. People accept that as normal in British politics. But that's just the start of the Prime Minister's powers. He alone decides, for example, when to dissolve Parliament and call fresh elections. I know the Governor General is in there somewhere, but we've seen how real that is. Coupled with the power to declare any vote a matter of confidence, it effectively places a gun to the head of any members on either side of the Commons who might be tempted to defeat a government bill. Mind you, if government MPs are powerless, they are Caesar himself compared to the opposition, who are supposedly trying to hold the government to account. Now, I want to pause here because I don't want to say it's only the job of the opposition to hold the government to account. There was a time not so long ago in this country where we thought members on the government side also had that responsibility. Up until World War II, the convention, if not the law, I'm not totally sure on that, but certainly the convention in this country was that if you were elected, I should say, if you were appointed to cabinet as a member of the governing caucus, you had to resign your seat and run in a by-election. You had to. Why? Because your role had changed. You had gone from being a watchdog on the government as a member of the governing caucus, but a watchdog on it, to a member of it. And you had to go back to your electors and ask their permission. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to that, because it has certain practical difficulties, as we discovered in a couple of crucial moments in our history. Because if you had a narrow majority and you appointed a cabinet, you lost your majority. And unscrupulous opposition politicians would take advantage of this, and that would include Sir John A. in 1864 and Mackenzie King in 1926. So it had its problems, but I sure like the spirit of it. But back to the opposition, holding government to account. Have you watched Question Period? They can't get their questions answered, and when they are answered, they're not answered. Somehow we've allowed this process where you can ask a question of a particular minister, and the minister will get a humble parliamentary secretary, a hapless other MP, to answer the question. When the Prime Minister deigns to answer questions, it's in some kind of code, but he only answers to certain types of MPs. I think it's just the opposition leaders. But it's not anything like, and again, I'm going to cite the British thing, because you can watch it now. This is the great thing nowadays, is we can compare and see just how miserable our system has become. Watch the British House of Commons, the British question period, particularly Prime Minister's question period. The questions are questions, the answers are answers. It's a miracle. But not only can they not get their questions answered, they can't get, as I mentioned, the documents they demand, and when they get them, let's quote the F-35 debacle, the figures in them can't be trusted. Let's repeat that. In a 21st century democracy, in the G8, a government can get away with putting out documents listing the costs of major military procurements that are off by a factor of 40 billion. In a decisive issue, or one of the decisive issues, in an election. And there are no consequences that flow from that. And on those rare occasions when a government is finally being held to account, when it's really coming under close scrutiny, when the opposition is finally getting a chance to hold their feet to the fire, it prorogues for months at a time. Now, there's nothing wrong with prorogation at all on its own. That's part of the parliamentary toolkit. But it was not typically the convention that you did so every time you got into trouble and every time you were asking questions that you didn't like. And the more often it's done, the easier it becomes. As we've seen, not only are we doing it now at the federal government level, but Ontario, Dalton McGuinty's final parting gift to the province was to prorogue and then resign, rather than face questions about the gas plant scandal. I don't know whether you're following it here, but it's a pretty major deal in Ontario. And not only proroguing, but proroguing and shutting Parliament for months at a time. If the issue was, as is often claimed, well, we needed to clear the decks, we needed to reset the parliamentary calendar, prorogue, come back the next day. No, we shut Parliament for months at a time, and indeed, there are legislatures now in this country that are meeting for less than 2 months of the year. This is a democracy? But I know what you're saying. They're still at the backstop of all this, the Confidence Convention. The government of the day is responsible to Parliament, and whatever else goes on, it must hold the confidence of the House of Commons or it falls. Yeah, well, tell it to Stephen Harper, who prorogued rather than face a confidence vote he was sure to lose. Tell it to Paul Martin, who lost a confidence vote in 2005, then spent the next 9 days trawling the opposition benches, offering jobs and other inducements that were not constitutionally in his power to bestow to win a do-over. Confidence Convention. It's only a convention, after all. Like ministerial responsibility, when's the last time you saw anyone responding to that? Like cabinet solidarity, supposedly a bedrock of our system. What did we see in the last couple of weeks? The Minister Denis Lebel, Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, with responsibility for files like the secession issue, coming out and saying, well, on this central question of Canada's existence, whether a 50% plus one vote in the referendum was sufficient to trigger negotiations, or whether it required some larger majority, said, I don't agree with the position of the government in which I serve on the file for which I'm responsible, with a law case in Quebec before the courts on this very question. And he is, as of today, still in cabinet. So cabinet solidarity, yeah, just a convention. They're all just conventions. Our system is founded on a whole series of these expectations and customs and precedents and conventions. And if we don't obey those conventions, if people just decide they're inconvenient and they just keep doing it, it just becomes easier and we don't know what to do in response. We don't have the kind of formalized checks and balances that the Americans do. Our system is frankly dependent upon decent chaps running things. And if decent chaps aren't running things, or if chaps who are perhaps decent decide not to behave decently, we're in a bit of trouble. So to recap, a party in the grip of a single leader and his coterie of advisors, though it offers little in the way of a serious platform and differs hardly at all with its main opposition, is nevertheless able, by a combination of false promises, venomous attack ads, and fortuitous media blunders, to stampede a little over a third of the electorate, or a fifth of the voting age population, into supporting it, which, when processed through the vote splits and other tricks of the first-past-the-post electoral system, is magically transformed into a majority. Thus empowered, the Prime Minister ruled with something approaching absolute powers until such time as he desires to repeat the process, ideally shortly after the opposition has exhausted its energies and its money choosing another leader, and we wonder why 40 or 50% of the voting age population don't turn out. So we have something, I submit, of a crisis on our hands, whether we know it or not. It is not only a crisis of legitimacy, it's an existential crisis. With so few Canadians bothering to take part in national elections, it's debatable who the resulting parliament is answerable to or what it represents. The very notion of Canadians as a single self-governing people is dissolving before our eyes. Well, how can we fix this? I wish I could say we could. I have a number of suggestions, which I'll run down in quick succession since we don't have a great deal of time and because they're unlikely ever to be implemented. Let me start first with this question of trust. I've elsewhere suggested what I call a Truth in Politics Act, and I want to make clear what this means so I'm not misunderstood, because I think in my speech yesterday some people took me as saying something I wasn't saying. Let me just talk about, first of all, about how we deal with the question of dishonesty in private life. If a company lies to consumers about its products, it faces stiff fines or worse. Likewise, if it cheats its investors, a prospectus cannot be false or even misleading. There are laws against libel and slander, as there are for those who fill out false information on welfare or immigration forms, all enacted by the same politicians who grant themselves license to tell much worse lies to many more people. Even within the political world, there are provisions against lying in certain circumstances. Politicians are forbidden to lie to each other, at least in Parliament, or about each other, a provision in the election laws of Canada and 8 of the provinces. But lie to the public about a major campaign promise is all part of the game. Now, to be sure, free and feisty political debates are critical to democracy, and I don't think any of us wants to have sort of a truth police skating all over the map and you know, following politicians around and crying gotcha. There's real potential for abuse in that, and it would really stifle a proper debate. But remember what I said. The issue isn't that the liars are prospering. It's that the honest politicians can't make themselves believed. So rather than any kind of blanket ban on political lying, that's not what I'm proposing. What I propose is to let politicians opt in, if they choose, at their own volition, to some sort of legal liability if the claims they're making are proving false. And again, there are examples of this in private life, from bonded couriers to sworn affidavits. People have found ways to solve this problem, to show that they are trustworthy by their willingness to assume certain penalties if they're not. So, suppose there were a provision of the Elections Act which a candidate could, at his discretion, invoke to cover particular statements or documents, such as a platform, rather like swearing an oath. So they would say, you know, in releasing my platform today, I invoke Article 9 of the Elections Act. Now, this wouldn't involve any kind of gotchas or people, you know, being caught out for stray slips of the lip on the campaign trail, but when they really needed to be believed, they'd have some means of persuading people. Over time, I have a feeling that once this started, opting in would become the norm rather than the exception. Secondly, the problem of attack ads. I have a very simple solution. You're familiar with the practice in the United States of the candidate coming on at the end, I'm John McCain and I approve this message. It hasn't worked because I don't think it went quite far enough. What I propose is make the candidate voice the ads. Imagine, if you will, a candidate, let's call him Stephen Harper, having to voice an ad about, you know, Michael Ignatieff. Michael Ignatieff, can we trust him? It would end in 2 days. The way our system works right now is the leader flies above the fray. He's nothing but honorable. He has only good things to say about his opponent. I would never dream of impugning his patriotism. And meanwhile, his minions at high pay are doing exactly that. This connects the dots. It removes the deniability from the leadership. It's total free speech. You can say anything you choose. There's no limit on what you can say about your opponents or about your campaign promises or anything else. You just have to own it. And I can't see the objection to that from any responsible person. Third, don't give them so much money. We don't need to spend nearly as much as we do on election campaigns. It's never been cheaper to communicate with large numbers of people than it is today. You know, email has reached Canada last I checked. And yet we're spending more than we ever have. And most of what we're spending it on is not helpful, it's hurtful. That money is going to robocalls and attack ads and push polls and highly paid strategists, and it's all mostly wasted. The only reason any of them, quote unquote, need the money is because the other guys have the money. If none of them have nearly as much money, they're still in a level playing field, but we have a much less costly, much less corrosive election. The politicians, the political class, have arranged for themselves the most extraordinarily generous political tax credits. 75% tax credit. You don't get anything like that if you're merely, trying to cure cancer or something. But if you're embarked upon the honorable profession of politics, you can charge it to the taxpayer to basically do a lot of stuff that annoys the taxpayer. So yeah, we got rid of the per vote subsidy, which I approve, but I don't think we need to have anything like the same generous tax credits or reimbursements that we now give. We could run our elections much cheaper and much cleaner elections they would be. Fourth, we need to fix the debates. I said I think debates can be an extraordinarily valuable exercise, and in fact, despite my cynical comments at the beginning, I'd like to see us, organize our election campaigns around them. What if instead of having one debate in each language where where everyone's wired and it all becomes a prize fight, what if we had a debate every week and had each of those debates in both languages? We know how to do that in this country. Have them in alternate hours, what have you. We can get over that. A debate a week, meaning you could experiment with different formats, you could have different people, wouldn't necessarily always have to be the leader in it. It means you could have different subject matter in each debate. You could really delve into depth and things. But most importantly, it would give the media something to do. I told you we can't help ourselves. I have no fixes here for us. But what if we had something to write about besides photo ops and gaffes and all the rest? What if we were writing about this? There's a debate coming up about foreign policy. Here are the major issues that are going to be at issue here. Here's how they're, whatever. And then afterwards, analyzing what was said, and fewer people will be watching, I grant you. It would not be as exciting, or would it? If you watched the last Quebec election campaign, they had, I believe, 4 debates, which is, getting close. And they were watched by enormous numbers of people because there were issues at stake and people wanted to watch. So I think you might still see quite large audiences, but it wouldn't be, the clash of the titans at Vegas. So organize election campaigns around a spine of these weekly debates and set the rules for them in advance in the election laws. Those of you who know your roles, we would be setting it behind a veil of ignorance. Nobody would know where they were going to be in the polls at some future date when the debates were being held. So they could negotiate, it would have to be negotiated obviously, but it would be negotiated where people wouldn't know where they're at and could probably come to some kind of fair arrangement rather than these ad hoc, last-minute, vested interest negotiations that determine them now. Fifth, and this may be a bit controversial, voting is, in my view, a civic duty, like jury duty. I see no objection, therefore, to making it mandatory. I don't think you have to have a large penalty. Nobody's going to go to jail. You could even do it as a positive incentive. You get a tax reward if you do it or something. But it seems to work in Australia. It's not going to work on its own. If all you did was that wouldn't be terribly helpful. But if you did that in concert with all these other changes I'm talking about, if you did things to make it worth people's while and gave them a little nudge, reminded them this isn't some game here, this is part of what you do when you're a citizen, is you go out and vote. You have a duty. We don't ask much of people in our society. We don't draft them into the army or anything. We just say, obey the law, pay your taxes, serve on juries, and vote. So I think at the margin this would help, not only in terms of the penalty or incentive, but just as a nudge, just as a reminder, we're all in this together. This is part of the good life, is taking an interest that you owe your fellow citizens, your counsel. As part of the mix, I think it would be helpful. And very briefly, I do think I am a fan of proportional representation, basically for the reasons I was outlining in the faults of first past the post. I don't really care which model. You get a room full of PR geeks together and we'll all, have a good, sit down over group quotas and Poisson distributions and everything. But what I do want is a system where every vote counts equally, every riding vote counts equally, where the candidates and the parties have to chase after every vote in every part of the country rather than writing large sections off as safely this or safely that, and just focusing on a few swing ridings and a few swing voters. I want a system where every vote counts equally. I don't want a system of winner-take-all politics, where you're all just betting the farm on that 2% swing of the vote. You know, when you talk about proportional representation, the first objection people make, of course, is, well, we'll have endless minority parliaments, and look at how crazy those minority parliaments we had were. That's in our system. And because our system is so highly leveraged, everybody in the minority parliament's got their finger over the button. Maybe if our vote goes up 2%, we might get a majority. So go, go, go. If you knew that a 2% swing in your vote meant 2% more seats, there's no incentive to pull the trigger. Everyone calms down, and it works like it works in most very well-functioning parliamentary democracies. Sweden or Norway or, you know, any of these very well. You know, if anybody in this room, if we're in the Q&A, talks about Israel and Italy, please don't. I know it's the first objection people say, that you take the most extreme dysfunctional countries and you don't take any of the 140 other countries that use it. It's a bit like saying if I was going to make an argument against first past the post and I said, well, that's the system in Zimbabwe. But of course, the most pressing thing is to fix our parliament. Now, you know, it's not going to be easy. I'll just run through a couple of very quick things, and again, they're going to be pretty much suggested by my critique earlier. We need to abolish the requirement for the leader's signature in the nomination papers. I've talked to people in other countries who are absolutely astonished that we have this requirement. They just cannot believe that we put up with this because of the way the power that it gives the leader. More contentiously, I think we need to go back to the system of letting the caucus choose the leader. It seems to work pretty well in Australia. I'm not saying, you know, that, I mean, I understand that people will say, well, that sounds undemocratic because we're used to having the membership at large choose it, but I think that becomes one of those self-reinforcing loops of logic. If you think that Parliament is kind of this irrelevant sideshow, which I would forgive you for thinking at this stage, then yeah, the job of the leader is kind of to be like a presidential candidate. So get out there and, you know, do campaign ads and tour the country, and why even bother going to Parliament, frankly? But it's to build support in the country at large. If you think that Parliament is at the center of our political life, or should be, if you want that to be the cockpit of democracy, if you think members of Parliament matter and you want to see issues debated in a real way and have, you know, constituents represented properly, and all of those things, then I think you're going to be a little more attuned to the idea that the job of the leader is to lead the caucus in Parliament and to be accountable and responsive to that caucus and to that Parliament. In which case, I think it'll make more sense. Now, I think one caveat on that to get people to accept it is we have to make the local democracy much more real in the way that we choose our local candidates. We cannot put up with any more of these stacked meetings and busloads of instant members and all the rest. And we've seen that in leadership races as well. But if we reform that system, if we insist upon, you know, long-term party membership, people who really have taken an interest and have a stake in the party voting, if people then feel, well, my local candidate really is the representative of my local riding association, and my MP really is the representative of my riding, I think they're going to be much more contented with the idea of my delegate, my representative will choose the leader to lead our party in Parliament. But we have to deal with this question of the ambition quotient. We need to cut the size of the cabinet for a lot of reasons. We need to have a cabinet that's actually a cabinet and not, as I say, some sort of, what did Donald Savoy call it, a focus group for the leader. We need a cabinet that's functional, but one of the many reasons is to make it harder to get into cabinet, to make fewer posts, to give MPs, therefore, more reason to look after other means of advancing themselves than simply currying a favor with the leader. We need to deal with the confidence convention and limit confidence motions to those explicitly designated as such by the mover. We cannot have this idea that every bill of any trivial import is somehow a confidence vote. We might even subject the power to dissolve or prorogue to a vote of the House, even require, as in the current UK experiment, some sort of supermajority to restore some measure of balance. And these are complicated questions. I would simply urge that you read a very fine recent book called Democratizing the Constitution by Mark Jarvis and Peter Coyne, which I think goes into these in some question. And they become particularly relevant, obviously, in a minority government situation as we had recently. Give the Speaker more power. if you look at this question of closure, for example, in the British Parliament, before you can move a motion of closure, the Speaker has to allow it. And he has discretion not to allow it. And he doesn't allow some of them. It seems to me that's a far preferable system to simply leaving it to the government of the day, with its majority, and with its palpable vested interest, to decide whether debate has gone on long enough or not. I think if debate has become dilatory, fine, but let's have an independent arbiter decide that, not one side of the House. And the same might apply to questions like, which MPs get to ask questions in the House, et cetera. We had a very good and nuanced ruling from the Speaker last spring over this. He opened the door for MPs if they choose. He said, I will recognize you if you rise in the House. You don't have to submit yourself to the party whip if you don't choose to, though he was told by the government, if you follow this debate, in no uncertain terms, you have no business ruling on this, which was the height of arrogance. But you've seen that MPs have not taken him up on it to a great extent, which shows you that you can change the rules, but you have to change the incentives and the power relationships as well. Well, there are any number of other reforms that would help to repair the balance of powers, subjecting senior appointments to parliamentary review, making the parliamentary budget officer an officer of Parliament rather than reporting to the Library of Parliament, et cetera, et cetera. But there's an obvious problem with all of these suggestions. They require the Prime Minister's assent to proceed. If Prime Minister has had any interest in limiting their own power, we wouldn't be in the fix we're in. And likewise, the other party leaders. If you remember, Mark Warrawa's motion was shut down by all party consent. All of the leaders put the word out, we don't want this eruption of MPs' independence. And all the parties fell obediently into line on this. But were ordinary members to decide collectively that they were no longer willing to be treated in this demeaning way, no doubt they could force the issue. But they've been conditioned to behave in a certain way. Each incursion on their prerogatives has habituated them to accept the next. Those of an independent bent are unlikely to be selected as nominees in the first place. If they do manage to make it through to Parliament, they face enormous pressure to be team players, not only from the leaders, but from their fellow caucus members. So it's tough. They're going to have to make a decision. It's up to them. None of these reforms are possible if MPs themselves are not prepared to stand up for their rights, if they cannot recover the self-respect that this is going to require. And yet, if ever a start were made, if they could start the ball rolling, surely it would continue, because they would create the platform for themselves to argue for more powers for themselves. The current downward spiral could be reversed. Suppose MPs of all parties were to band together and demand as a first step an end to the leaders' veto over nominations. Could the leaders really withstand that challenge? And thus liberated, would MPs not call for further reforms? Who knows? But no, it's not up to them, really. It's up to us. Nothing's going to change if we, the voters, don't pay attention, if we don't care, if we don't make people pay the price when they ignore and belittle our members, and by extension, us. We've lived without a functioning Parliament for so long that it doesn't occur to us what we've lost. So we have to look past the Parliament that is to the Parliament that could be. We have to see what a remarkable thing it is, this little playhouse where the life of the nation is acted out each day. We have to understand that this is our house, and the MPs are us. No other body represents all of us rather than just some of us, and as such, no other body can perform quite the same function as Parliament. Without it, the government would have a monopoly on the people's business. There would be no mechanism for forcing other issues and ideas onto the national agenda, nor any means of representing the particular interests and concerns of the people of each riding. It is at the same time the only forum in this God-forsaken country where all of our many regions and interests and identities are forced to reckon with each other, to balance their own needs against the rest. It's the only body to whom the government is constitutionally obliged to answer, not occasionally or at its pleasure, but every day. It is what enables us to hold the government to account, not just at election time, but all the time. If we understood this more fully, that they are us, that this is where we debate the issues of the day, where we hold our government to account, where we decide what bills shall be passed, then we would be less tolerant of seeing the people who represent us treated with such contempt, because it is we who are thereby insulted. Oh, well, I've forgotten someone, haven't I? The media. If ever MPs are to be released from the irons of party discipline, we, the journalists, have to stop assisting their wardens. We have to stop running around as if the world were coming to an end every time an MP departs from the party line. The story there is not party divided. The story is MP does job. Who knows? Maybe one day that will no longer be considered news. To save our democracy, we have to restore public faith in the political process. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It is broke. Let's fix it. Thank you very much, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you, Andrew, on behalf of all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. There's a microphone there, so
Too long.
just to assist so that we can all hear. We've got a question for Andrew. Please present yourself to the microphone and ask away. Oh, sorry.
Front row, yeah. I don't know if people at the back of the room. So I'm actually from the Department of Communication and Culture, and I study voting turnout. But seeing that we're in the law school or the faculty of law, I'm wondering about two instances you haven't addressed. One would be the Supreme Court, and you mentioned both Israel and Italy as dysfunctional, yet they have very strong Supreme Court. So does the U.S., who has a first past the poll system. Where do you think the Canadian Supreme Court stands, if at all? And that brings me to another legal institute, the Auditor General. Some countries in the world, especially in Europe, have the prerogative of turning Auditor General reports into an actual police investigation. Where do we stand on that one?
I don't know the answer to the second question. I think that's effectively what happened with, for example, the sponsorship scandal. Frankly, probably should have happened with the F-35, but I'm not sure I understand the question about the Supreme Court. What were you getting at? What was the nub there?
In certain democracies, citizens, parties, not necessarily MPs, but any non-governmental organization can appeal to the court to abolish a governmental policy.
Right.
Where do we stand on that?
Well, I mean,
people can do that hypothetically.
yeah, well, we can in our system, and I've had my debates with Ted Morton, if he's still here, about this, that you know, we have a process of judicial review, that any law that is not in consonance with the Constitution is of no force or effect. I view that as being a perfectly democratic exercise because that Constitution itself was passed by democratic Parliament, and Parliament can sovereignly bind itself in that way if it so chooses. So I think that is a healthy process that by and large works. That you have to have, again, an independent arbiter to compare two laws and decide whether they're consistent with each other. Otherwise, it's like me vouching for my own checks. You have to have somebody who can say, no, that law you passed is not consistent with that other law that Parliament passed. So I think that is part of the democratic process. We have to be able to understand and believe in our laws that are passed. And we have to believe that they're consistent with each other, that not just arbitrary and made up as they go along kind of thing. So I think it does work. I think we've seen it working very well in our system not only since we brought in the Charter of Rights, by the way, but of course the whole Constitution since our founding. I haven't agreed with every ruling, of course, but you sometimes get people who think that the Charter of Rights, first of all, they think it was sort of dropped on us from a passing jet. that we didn't actually pass this into our law ourselves. It was just somehow imposed on us. And second of all, you'll get people saying, well, we did all right without a written constitution until then, as if the B&A Act had been passed down, in legend and song. This is written constitutions are a pretty old thing, because if you look at the British Constitution, it would include things like the 1688 Bills of Rights and go back to Magna Carta. All of these things were actually written down on paper. So that weird prejudice I have never understood. But I certainly welcomed the addition of the Charter of Rights to the canon, and I think it has improved the government of our country. And I'll just say one other thing about the Auditor General and posts like that. They are remarkable offices and remarkable office holders. The people in those, a lot of the power in those jobs resides in the individuals who are in them. It's not just the powers they have, it's the way that they behave themselves. You know, a Sheila Fraser was not going to be trifled with. And yet we're seeing attempts to mau these offices. The way in which the parliamentary budget officer has been treated, I think, is disgraceful. And there have been attempts to limit the roles and the prerogatives of the information and privacy commissioners as well, again, under parties of both, governments of both parties. And there was even a short-lived attempt at a whisper campaign about Sheila Fraser during the height of at the beginning of the sponsorship scandal. It died pretty quickly because it was clear it was not going to work. But we saw after the F-35, you know, Laurie Hahn MP going out and saying, well, the Auditor General doesn't understand basic accounting terms. So there's another convention that we kind of obey and listen to these responsible individuals that's being undermined.
Thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. I'd just like to know what your thoughts are on the idea of recall elections and if you think that they could accomplish something within Canada to put some power back into the hands of voters.
I'm not a huge fan. I suppose I might be persuaded if there was an extremely high bar. But my view of the relationship between the electorate and their MP, it's not really Burkean. Burke had this kind of much more sort of elevated idea that the MP was sort of had an independent mandate almost, that he didn't have to be responsive at all. I'd rather put it as it's like the relationship between a chief executive and his or her subordinates. If you're smart as a chief executive, you delegate authority. You let people get on with the job on a day-to-day basis, but you reserve the right to make the big decisions. Now, big decisions would include hiring and firing, and that's what we do at elections. But I also make room in that for referendums. You know, I don't see it as being any kind of assault on parliamentary democracy to add to that referendums on big questions that the public has expressed a strong desire to pass judgment on. To me, that's the boss of the system doing what bosses do. But if that boss is smart, as I say, they'll leave the day-to-day running of a government to the people they've hired to do that. And you need to leave room for people to screw up a little bit. So I worry if you have recall that people are going to be looking over their shoulders, you know, too much. I think that gets the balance out of whack.
I really liked what you said about no real visible difference between the parties. I really find, especially in elections, it seems like a competition to spend more, tax less, and there's no context as to how much has already been spent on that item or what that means in terms of bottom line, or, you know, being able to verify that, like, say, F-35s, that you have a source for how much that cost. What do you think about, in addition to your point about, you know, a Truth in Elections Act, requiring parties for each promise to assign a dollar value to it, and then also provide a source, you know, whether it's construction quote or something like that, and then have, I mean, a hypothetical independent office, you know, say like an Auditor General, actually verify those claims and add it all up into a bottom line that can actually show, you know, Canadians what parties are promising, you know, based on the premise that democracy is about, you know, people picking parties based on their values, you know, not just flash.
I'll give that some thought. At first brush, I would say I think that goes a little too far, sort of micromanaging the thing. I think the problem with the F-35s was we didn't have basic info of what the government numbers were. And we absolutely, as a constitutional matter, have a right to that. And that gets into the problems of the fact that we still have a system where the numbers are the total preserve of the finance department and of the government as a whole. I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. I think the PBO, far from being diminished as it seems to be on its way to, I would enlarge its mandate. It seems to me I don't see anything wrong with the idea that all of the parties should be working off the same set of numbers, that whatever numbers the government has access to, the opposition should have access to as well, which is much more the Congressional Budget Office model. I don't think that takes away any, a vastly important prerogative of the government of the day if they simply share the numbers with the opposition, and then you can argue about what the numbers mean and what you want to do with them, but at least you're working off the same set of figures. In an election campaign, as I say, my first instinct is to say I think that's more the responsibility of us and the media, et cetera, to vet those numbers. If the parties are smart, they're going to make them as transparent as possible. It's because they're going to pay a price if they're clearly fudging them.
Hi.
Hello.
What kind of steps can members of civil society take in order to put pressure on their governments to enact these democratic changes, particularly with a government that is heavy on a crime agenda and likes to ignore any form of protest?
Well, I don't have a very good answer to that. I just think it's going to be the traditional, for the most part anyway, the traditional mechanisms of getting involved with the party of your choice. Might be the governing party, might be another party. And each of those offers avenues of some kind to make your views known. It's hard to mobilize people in the streets for this kind of thing. Very rarely will people get that excited. And this is the difficulty, right? It's all by degrees. There's no sort of crisis points. There was a little bit of one, over the prorogation, the quick prorogation thing. We saw people actually demonstrating that. That was kind of cool. But it's very hard to get that going in any, for the most part, because it's not, as I say, it's not tyranny descending on us. It's just kind of this slow erosion. So I think it's going to be more a case of getting involved in the political process, trying to make it matter to the candidates for the party that you support, to push it up the agenda. I've heard it said that we ran this experiment in 2011, that the opposition parties campaigned on democratic reform and the government campaigned on the economy, and the economy won. I don't think that's necessarily conclusive. I don't think the opposition really made a serious effort at making this an issue. They sort of had a very thin gruel, frankly, of reforms, and they more or less dropped them when they didn't get an immediate echo. And you can't necessarily just do it right away anyway. But it's a challenge. It's going to be a great challenge to kind of rouse people out of their complacency about this. Because, as I say, you get habituated to it. If you've never seen a functioning parliament, then you wonder what the fuss is about why people want to have a functioning parliament. You've got nothing to compare it to. So raising people's consciousness over that is going to be serious, because as long as the economy is not in bad shape, as long as it's ticking over, people are going to be loath to substitute one party for another. And I'm not here to advocate for any party or another, but the only way that this is going to be made an election issue is if A, it's made an election issue, and B, people's other concerns about the economy, et cetera, can also be resolved.
Thank you.
One final question.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how we fund journalism currently. So it strikes me that without really robust journalism, without really robust coverage, the public don't really have real access to democracy. And my impression is that we're not sort of preserving the profession of journalism the way we might want to if we're making that connection between democracy and journalism.
I'm going to disagree respectfully.
Yeah? Oh, great.
As bad and awful and terrible as the journalism I described is,
Yeah.
it's probably better than it's been. We are living, it's a terrible time to be a journalist in many ways.
Yeah.
It's a great time to be a journalist in other ways. The profession, the industry is going through hell, and it's going to continue to go through hell. It's hard getting hired, et cetera. It's never been easier to get your stuff in front of the public. So if you're a starting out journalist, maybe you're not employed, but 30 years ago you wouldn't have been employed and nobody would be reading your stuff. Now you can get it out in front of people, and people will discover your voice. And I know of all kinds of young journalists who now have gained employment because they were discovered because they had a blog or whatever. Second point is, for the reader, you've never had more diversity of voices, not only within this country, but around the world. There's never been more at your fingertips that you can read. And I suspect that's going to continue. I think, so in some ways, in that way, we're in a golden age. But we have to figure out how to make the business model work. And I think that's the only, to my way of thinking, the only answer is to get really robust, lively journalism, you got to be able to make a buck at it. The minute you become somebody's ward, even if you're just on a money-losing paper, you can always feel it. And I certainly, if this is where you're going, I'm certainly unalterably opposed to public funding of it.
Yeah.
We came very close in 1980, I think it was, the Kent Commission recommended that we should have funding of the newspapers, and it was a very well-meaning thing to improve it. But I know what would have happened. I mean, it's a miracle. I think we were the first industry in the history of the world to turn down government lolly. But it's a miracle, because if we'd taken it, we would have become accustomed to it. We would have become entitled to it. We would have write long, feeling articles about how nobody could possibly put out a newspaper in this cold country without government support. And we become particularly interested, therefore, in every other industry's case for government support, and we would have all just become wards of the state. I would rather we had a messy, rambunctious, flawed, sometimes slanderous, all of those things. I'd rather have, to me, creativity is the handmaiden of vulgarity. You need all of these things in the mix. And when you have lots of people trying to scrape out a living doing it, trying to appeal to a reader, and it doesn't have to be on a pandering, lowbrow, stupid basis, because there's many different types of readers out there. But if you're not fundamentally attuned to your reader, and one of the ways that you're attuned to your reader is because the reader's paying your lunch, then I think you're indulging yourself. I think writing is about the readers, and if it's not about the readers, you should find another line of work.
Okay. May I follow up, or should I?
Absolutely not.
No. I just want to make sure we're fine for time. I guess I was, okay,
This kind of thing leads to anarchy.
I guess I was wondering in particular about our capacity for investigative journalism. So when it's awesome, you're right, it's awesome that a lot of people have access to blogging, but investigative journalism, it seems like you need money to do that.
Absolutely, and for those who think that the quote-unquote mainstream media can be tossed in the ash can and we'll just have citizen journalism doing it all, I actually think the mainstream media has had a pretty good run the last few months. You know, it was investigative journalists for CTV that uncovered the Duffy affair. Yeah. It was the Globe and the Star in Toronto that uncovered they mixed together in my mind, the Ford business. There have been a series of these things. So it makes the case, you're absolutely right, that it takes money. I'm just nervous about money that's too well-meaning.
Awesome, thank you.
Well, that's an appropriate, though. We began with preferred